Dr. Owen Calloway had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 11 months. He had stopped expecting that to change. He was the last trained physician within 100 miles of Camp Ridgeline, maybe farther, and that fact alone had kept him breathing when others hadn't been so fortunate. People needed him. People protected what they needed. He had learned early that in a collapsed world, usefulness was the only currency that actually spent. Before the collapse, he had been an ER physician at a regional hospital 40 minutes outside the city, a job he had taken because the pay suited him and the pay was better than the university clinic. He had been good at it. Fast decisions, incomplete information, the particular kind of focus that emergencies demanded. He was still good at it. The conditions had simply changed. He had no surgical suite anymore, no imaging equipment, no sterile field worth mentioning. He had what he could scavenge and what survivors brought him. And he made it work because there was no alternative to making it work. Camp Ridgeline had been built around a former agricultural supply warehouse on the edge of a small rural town whose name nobody used anymore. The warehouse was solid and dry and defensible, with a chain-link perimeter that the original founders had reinforced with scavenged lumber, stripped car hoods, and several hundred feet of razor wire sourced from a farm supply depot 3 towns over. It wasn't comfortable. It held. In the current world, holding was the entire goal. The camp had just under 60 people at last count, a number that shifted week to week as new arrivals appeared at the gate and others slipped away in the night. Owen's medical bay was 8 cots sectioned off from the main sleeping area by a hanging wall of industrial curtain. His examination table was a folding table. His supply cabinet had come from the town's former veterinary clinic, wheeled in by hand over cracked pavement. The vet supplies had proven more useful than he liked to admit. He kept notes in a water-resistant field journal he carried in his jacket at all times, a habit from the early months when he'd been moving constantly and couldn't leave anything behind. The journal was nearly full. He had not yet decided whether to start a second one or simply stop writing things down. Declan ran the camp the way certain men run things in a crisis. Not because anyone elected him, but because he was loud and decisive and physically imposing in a way that made frightened people default to his judgment. He was not a bad man by the old world standards. He kept watch rotations organized and made hard calls about rationing without flinching. He had twice led armed parties outside the wire to clear road blockages, and both times he brought everyone back. Owen neither liked nor disliked him. He respected the function Declan served and kept a careful professional neutrality, the same neutrality he had used in hospitals when getting along with the people who control resources mattered more than being right about everything. Lena was different. She had arrived 3 months after Owen, alone, carrying a compound bow she had clearly learned to use out of necessity rather than any prior interest, looking for the pattern he had not yet named, the turn at the fence. Milo's wound, 3 separate incidents over the past 2 months of a turned individual lingering near camp with a stillness that didn't match the frantic, noise-seeking behavior everyone had documented and treated as gospel. He had written each incident down with date and time and said nothing because he understood the information was dangerous in the wrong hands. Declan's response to uncertainty about the turn was always the same. Eliminate the variable. It was defensible. It had kept 60 people alive. But Owen was a physician, and physicians did not eliminate variables before understanding them. He closed the journal and lay back on the cot with his boots still on and stare at the ceiling and let himself think about Judith. Judith Crane had been one of his patients at the regional hospital, a woman in her early 60s with managed hypertension and a dry sense of humor that had made their quarterly appointments something he genuinely looked forward to. She had lived on Delwood Street, about 1.5 miles from the camp's current location. He had seen her once since the collapse, at a distance, near the eastern fence. On the second night, the figure had appeared. He had not been certain then. He was more certain now. He lay in the dark and listened to the camp settle into its nighttime sounds and did not sleep for a long time. And when he finally did and woke again before dawn with the journal still in his hand, he knew what he was going to do next. Even though he knew it was going to cost him, he thought about what it would mean if he was right, not just for himself, but for everyone behind the wire. The Turn were aggressive. The Turn were mindless. The Turn did not grab and release. They did not return to specific locations with the consistency of routine. They did not look at you like they remembered something. Every protocol Declan enforced, every decision the camp made about how close was too close, and when to shoot and when to run, was built on those assumptions. If even one of them was wrong, the implications were not small. Owen understood that he was standing at the edge of something that could not be unstarted. Once he went to Delwood Street. Once he looked at what was there and brought that information back, the camp would never be able to return to the simpler version of the world it had been operating in. He was not naive enough to think everyone would respond to new information by updating their understanding. Some people dug in harder when the ground shifted. He had watched that happen in hospitals, and he had watched it happen out here in sharper and more permanent ways. He rolled onto his side on the cot and looked at the curtain separating his space from the main floor, the low sounds of 60 people sleeping behind it. He had spent 11 months keeping people alive one day at a time. He was not sure yet whether what he had seen at the fence was a threat to that work or the most important thing he had ever observed. He only knew that he could not look away from it. He sat up before the can began to stir, found a clean page in the journal, and began to write down everything he remembered about Judith Crane. He wrote her age, 63 at her last visit, and her address as best he could reconstruct it from memory. He wrote down the 3 times he believed he had seen the figure near the eastern fence, and the details that had caught his attention each time. The stillness, the location, the fact that it kept coming back. He wrote down what Milo had said verbatim, because exact phrasing always mattered in medicine. He wrote down his working hypothesis, hedged the way a careful clinical note should be. Some turned individuals may retain behavioral fragments that approximate memory-driven routine. Mechanism unknown. Population percentage unknown. Implications for threat assessment and camp safety protocols require further investigation before any conclusions can be drawn. He read it back, and it looked absurd on paper. The kind of thing that would give Declan a reason to question his judgment at exactly the wrong moment. He closed the journal and tucked it back into his jacket and sat in the quiet for another few minutes. Outside the curtain, he could hear the first sound of the camp waking up, someone stoking the cook fire, the low voices of the overnight watch coming off rotation. He would say nothing today. He would watch and wait and gather more before he moved. And in 2 days, when the rotation put Declan's attention on the western perimeter for the morning sweep, Owen was going to walk to Delwood Street and find out whether Judith Crane was still going home. Owen did not go to Delwood Street the next morning. He waited the way he had always waited in medicine when instinct told him to move, but the situation required more information first. He spent the day working, treating a sprained wrist on one of the watch crew, checking on Milo's sutures, restocking what he could from the supply cabinet. He kept his movements normal and his expression neutral, and he did not look toward the eastern fence more than any other part of perimeter. Milo was healing cleanly. The wound had closed without signs of infection, which had been Owen's first concern, and continued to occupy a quiet corner of his attention even after the sutures looked good. He had not told anyone what Milo had described, not the grab, not the release, not the fact that it had been one of the turn and not a piece of debris or a fence edge that had opened that laceration. He needed to understand himself before he handed it to anyone else, and he was not close to understanding it yet. Lena came by the medical bay that evening, as she usually did. She res-tacked a row of supply boxes that had shifted during the day and asked him, without looking up, whether he had eaten. He told her he had. She did not appear to believe him, but she did not push it. which was one of the things he appreciated about her. She had a way of registering concern without converting it into pressure, a quality that was rarer than most people recognized. She asked about Milo, and Owen said he was recovering well and would be fit for light duties within a week. She nodded and moved a bottle of antiseptic from one shelf to another for no structural reason he could identify. He watched her do it and said nothing. After she left, he sat at the folding table with his journal open and added 3 sentences to his notes. The figure at the eastern fence had not appeared the previous night. He did not know whether that was significant. He wrote it down anyway because he learned over 11 months that the things that seemed insignificant were often the things that mattered most in retrospect. 2 days later, he went to Delwood Street. He left before the camp was fully awake, in the gray hour before the cook fire was started, telling the gate watch that he was doing a supply check on a residential block he had scouted 2 weeks ago, which was plausible enough that the watch waved him through without comment. He carried his field bag and a short-handled tool he kept for prying open stuck doors, and he moved along the edge of the road in a way he had learned to move out here, quiet and close to cover, eyes scanning ahead into the sides in a pattern that had become as automatic as breathing. Delwood Street was 4 blocks from the camp perimeter, a residential street of older single-story houses set back from a road behind overgrown front yards. Most of the houses showed the standard markers of abandonment: broken windows, collapsed gutters, front doors standing open or missing entirely. Owen counted house numbers from the corner and found the one he was looking for midway down the block on the left side. The house was a pale yellow that had faded to something closer to gray, with a covered front porch and a maple tree in the yard that had not been trimmed in over a year. The front door was closed. That was the first thing he noticed, because closed doors on abandoned houses meant something. Either someone had been there recently or something had pulled it shut from inside. He stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment and listened. The street was quiet in the specific way that streets out here were quiet, an absence that felt deliberate rather than natural. He crossed the yard and stepped onto the porch and stood with his hand on the door handle for 3 full breaths before he opened it. The smell hit him first, not the smell of death, which he knew too well and would have recognized immediately, but something older and more domestic, dust and wood, and the faint ghost of a candle that had been burned down sometime in the past few weeks. He stepped inside and let his eyes adjust to the dimness. The front room was intact. That was the second thing he noticed. Not ransacked the way most houses were by now, not stripped of anything useful. The furniture was in place. There was a throw blanket folded over the back of the couch in a way that looked deliberate. On the kitchen table, visible from where he stood, there was a single ceramic mug positioned in the center of the table, as though someone had set it there with intention. Owen did not touch anything yet. He stood in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen and looked at every surface slowly and carefully, the way he looked at a patient before he started asking questions, trying to read the situation before he introduced himself into it. The mug was clean. Not dusty the way everything else in the house was dusty, but recently clean, or at minimum recently moved. A chair at the kitchen table was pulled out at an angle, the specific angle of someone who had sat in it and not pushed it back when they stood. He had seen that detail in houses before, and it usually meant scavengers, but scavengers did not wash mugs and fold throw blankets. He moved into the kitchen and opened the cabinet above the sink. Inside, for mugs were arranged in a neat row, handles all facing the same direction. He closed the cabinet carefully. He found a photograph on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, a woman in her early 60s, standing in a garden, squinting into the sun with a small smile. He knew the face. He had seen it across an examination table a dozen times in another life. He stood there with the photograph in his hand for longer than he meant to, not because he hadn't known, not because this confirmed something he hadn't already suspected, but because there was a difference between suspecting something and standing in the kitchen of a dead woman's house holding a photograph of her while knowing that she was still coming back here. The sound from upstairs was soft. A single footstep, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor directly above his head. Owen set the photograph down on the windowsill, exactly where he had found it, and did not move. There was another step, then silence. He stood between the kitchen table and the counter with his hand resting on his field bag, his eyes on the ceiling, and he did not make a sound, and the silence from upstairs settled down around him like something breathing. He had run to the possibilities in the seconds since the sound, the way he triaged in the ER, fast and without sentiment. If it was a turned individual upstairs, it would have reacted to him by now. Sound carried in empty houses. He had not been quiet enough coming in to avoid being heard by anything with functional senses, and the turn responded to sound with urgency, not with a single careful step followed by silence. Whatever was upstairs was being deliberate. That understanding did not make it less dangerous. It made it differently dangerous, which was almost worse because it meant he could not predict the response. He took one step back toward the front room, and the floor gave a soft creak beneath his boot, and the silence upstairs deepened in a way he felt more than heard, a held quality, an awareness. He stopped moving. Several seconds passed. Then came the sound of something slow, descending the staircase, one step at a time, with the labored rhythm of a body that was not moving the way it once had. Owen put his back against the kitchen counter and watched the doorway that opened onto the front room where the base of the staircase was. He did not reach for anything in his field bag. He had learned in the first months that reaching for a weapon was sometimes a wrong read on situation, that the action itself could change what happened next in ways that couldn't be undone. He waited. She appeared in the doorway one piece at a time, the way people appear when they are coming around a corner, slowly. First her shoulder, then the side of her face, then the rest of her. She was wearing the same clothes Owen had seen from a distance at the fence, a gray cardigan and dark trousers, and she was in the condition he expected her to be in, pale and altered in the specific way of the turn, the eyes flat and clouded, the movement carrying none of the fluid ease of living muscle. She stopped when she reached the doorway. She did not come further into the kitchen. She stood at the threshold, and her clouded eyes moved across the room with something that was not quite focused, but was also not the blind, noise-seeking sweep he had documented in every other turned individual he had observed. They moved to the photograph on the windowsill. They moved to the mug on the table. They moved to Owen. She looked at him for 3 seconds. He counted them. Then she turned and walked back to the front room, and he heard her settle into what he was certain was the couch, the soft compression of old cushions under weight, and then there was nothing but silence again. Owen stood in the kitchen with his back against the counter and his heart doing something methodical and loud in his chest, and he understood that he had just witnessed something that rewrote every assumption the camp had built itself on. She had not attacked. She had not reacted to him as a target or a threat or a source of noise. She had looked at the objects in her kitchen, and she had looked at him, and she had gone back to the couch. He did not know what that meant in terms he could defend in front of Declan or anyone else, but he had the image of it locked behind his eyes, the specific quality of those 3 seconds of eye contact, and he knew he was not going to be able to set it down or look away from it. He moved to the front room without looking at the couch directly and let himself out the front door and pulled it shut behind him the way he had found it and walked back toward camp in the early morning light with his field bag over his shoulder and 4 new pages worth of questions opening up in his mind with every step. Back at camp, he went straight to the medical bay and sat down and opened his journal and wrote without stopping for 20 minutes. He wrote down the closed door, the folded blanket, the mug, the arranged cabinet, the photograph, the footstep, the way she had moved through the doorway and stopped, the 3 seconds she had looked at him, the way her eyes had gone to the objects before they came to him, as though she was checking on things she knew the location of. He wrote the word routine and circled it. He wrote memory with a question mark beside it. Then he wrote, She went back to the couch. He stared at that sentence for a long time. When Lena appeared at the curtain an hour later with a bowl of oatmeal, she wordlessly held out to him. He took it without argument and ate it without tasting it. She watched him with the careful attention she reserved for situations where she had already decided something was wrong. He told her he had found supplies on his morning run. She looked at the field bag, which was as full as it had been when he left, and said nothing. He did not sleep that afternoon. He lay on the cot and thought about Agnes. Agnes Crane was 26 years old and had been at Camp Ridgeline for 5 months. She had arrived with a group of 4 who had traveled together from the eastern settlements, and she was the only one of 4 who had made it to the gate in good enough condition to stay. Owen had treated the others, 2 for infected wounds and 1 for a fever that had already moved past the point where he could do much, and he had watched Agnes sit outside a medical bay for 3 days straight without being asked to leave, quiet and practical and present in a way that told him she had already done most of her grieving on the road. She had integrated into camp life without friction. She pulled her weight on watch rotations and food prep, and did not complain, and did not ask for more than her share of anything. Declan had placed her on the eastern perimeter team within her first 2 weeks, which was not where he put people he was uncertain about. Owen had never told her that he had been her mother's doctor. There had been no reason to in the beginning, when he still had some uncertainty about the figure at the fence, and now there was every reason not to, because the information would not help her, and would very possibly break something in her that was currently holding together. He did not think it was his information to give. He also understood that this position was going to become harder to maintain the longer he kept what he knew to himself. She came to him 3 days after his visit to Delwood Street. She sat on the edge of one of the cots in the medical bay with her hands clasped between her knees and told him she had been having trouble sleeping. He asked her the standard questions, and she answered them without evasion. No appetite changes, no physical symptoms, just a persisting inability to fall asleep before the early hours of the morning, and a feeling she described as being watched that she said she knew was probably just anxiety. He told her it was normal. He told her most people at the camp cycled through periods like this, and that the body had a way of recalibrating given time and stability. She nodded and thanked him and did not move to leave. He waited. She asked him if he had ever had a patient who seemed fine on the outside, but was operating from a place of fundamental wrongness underneath, something that was hard to name or point to, but that a doctor might be able to detect. He told her that instinct was a valid clinical tool, and that unexplained feelings of wrongness in the patient often pointed towards something real. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that she had seen something near the eastern fence the previous night, during her watch, that she had not reported. He kept his face neutral and asked her what she had seen. She said there had been a turned individual at the fence, which was not unusual, but that it had been standing in a way that was different from the others, still rather than restless, and that when she had raised her light toward it, it had turned and walked away slowly instead of pressing toward the light the way they always did. She said she had not reported it because she did not want to sound like she was losing it. Owen told her she did not sound like she was losing it. He did not tell her anything else. After she left, he stood at the entrance to the medical bay and looked at the eastern fence line and understood that he was running out of time to keep his observations private. The figure was not limiting itself to nighttime appearances. It was not avoiding the light the way the turned avoided it. It was adapting, or doing something that looked enough like adapting to make the distinction nearly academic. He spent the afternoon treating a cut on a child's hand and helping redistribute the week's antibiotics and saying nothing to anyone. And in the evening, he told Lena he needed to talk to her about something and watch her face go still in a way it did when she was preparing for bad news. He did not tell her everything. He told her he had been observing unusual behavior in a turned individual near the eastern fence for several weeks, and that he had reason to believe it was worth monitoring rather than eliminating before they understood what they were looking at. He told her about the stillness and the directional awareness and the eye contact. He did not tell her about Delwood Street or the mug on the table or the 3 seconds in the kitchen doorway. Lena listened without interrupting, which was how she always listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he could hear the campfire outside. Then she asked him what he needed from her. He said he needed her to not tell Declan until he had more to show. She looked at him the way she looked at things she hadn't decided about yet. Then she nodded once and went back to the supply shelf she had been organizing and did not say anything else about it that night, which was the closest thing to unconditional support he had received from another person in nearly a year. He returned to Delwood Street 2 mornings later. The door was closed again. The mug was in the same position on the table. The throw blanket had been moved, or he believed it had been moved, repositioned on the couch in a way that was subtly different from what he remembered, though he could not be certain because he had not thought to photograph it on the first visit. He stood in the kitchen and listened, and after 4 minutes he heard the step on the floor above him, the same single deliberate step as before. He did not go upstairs. He was not ready for that yet, and he was not sure the information it would give him was worth the risk the staircase represented. He checked the rest of the ground floor instead, moving slowly through each room, cataloging details. In the small room off the hallway that had been used as an office, he found a desk with papers still on it, a couple of pens, a framed certificate on the wall from a gardening club dated 11 years ago. In the bedroom at the back of the house, he found a bed that had not been slept in, the covers undisturbed, and a pair of reading glasses on a nightstand that he stood and looked at for a long time without knowing why. He checked every room and found nothing that contradicted his working theory, and several things that quietly reinforced it: the absence of chaos, the specific arrangement of objects, the sense of a space that was being maintained rather than simply occupied. He was back at the front door when he heard it. Not a step this time. A sound from the top of the stairs that he had no clinical category for, low and formless and brief, lasting no more than 2 seconds before it stopped. He stood with his hand on the front door and did not move. The sound did not come again. He let himself out and stood on the porch in the morning air and wrote 3 words in his journal before he started walking. She is aware. He got back to camp to find Declan waiting for him at the gate with his arms crossed and an expression that told Owen the conversation he had been preparing for had arrived earlier than expected. Declan did not raise his voice. That was the thing about him that Owen had come to understand was more dangerous than if he had. The way he kept everything flat and measured when he was angry, like a man who had learned early that volume was a concession. He asked Owen where he had been. Owen told him he'd been doing a supply run on the residential blocks to the east. Declan said that the eastern blocks were outside the approved solar range and that Owen knew that. Owen said he had assessed the risk as acceptable given what he was looking for. Declan looked at the field bag, the same way Lena had looked at it 2 days earlier, and asked what he had found. Owen said a few things worth cataloging for a future run. Nothing he could carry alone. Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he told Owen that 2 members of the watch had reported unusual term behavior near the eastern fence over the past week, and that he was planning to send a clearing team out that afternoon to address the situation. Owen asked him what unusual meant. Declan described what Agnes had described to Owen 3 days earlier, almost word for word: the stillness, the slow retreat from light, the sense of directed awareness. Owen said he thought a clearing team was premature, and that what they were seeing might be worth observing before they acted on it. Declan looked at him with the flat patience of a man who had already made his decision and was only listening now as a formality. He said that the safety of the camp was not an experiment, and that Owen's job was medicine, not threat assessment. Owen did not argue. He did not have enough to argue with yet. Not the kind of concrete, demonstrable evidence that would hold up against Declan's particular brand of certainty. He said he understood and walked to the medical bay and sat down and thought carefully about how much time he had left. The clearing team went out at 2 in the afternoon, 6 people armed and purposeful, and they came back 2 hours later having found nothing to clear. Declan made no comment about this at the camp dinner. Owen ate his food and watched Agnes across the fire and thought about everything she did not know. That night, the figure appeared at the eastern fence again, and this time Owen was not the only one watching. Lena was beside him at the entrance to the medical bay, close enough that he could hear her breathing, and they stood together without speaking and watched Judith Crane stand at the wire in the dark and do nothing. And after several minutes, she turned and moved away into the dark the way she always did, unhurried, purposeful, going back to the house on Delwood Street, where her daughter's photograph sat on the windowsill, and her mug sat on the table, and the blanket on the couch had been folded, and refolded more times than Owen could count. Lena said his name quietly. He said he knew. She asked him what they were going to do. He did not have an answer yet, but he told her he was going back to the house in the morning, and this time he was going upstairs. He had been building toward it since the first visit, and understood that avoiding the upstairs was a way of managing his own fear more than a sound decision. Lena asked if he wanted her to come with him. He thought about it longer than expected. Having her there would change the dynamic, and he did not yet know whether that would be useful or disruptive. He told her he would go alone, and that if he was not back by mid-morning, she should tell Declan what she knew. She said it was not a satisfying answer. He told her it was the only one he had. She was quiet for another moment, and then she went back inside without saying goodnight, which was her version of accepting something she did not like. He stood at the fence entrance alone for another few minutes after she left, watching the dark where Judith had been, and then he went inside and sat on his cot and did not open his journal. For the first time in 11 months, he did not write anything down before he slept. Some things needed to stay unwritten a little longer. Owen left before first light with his field bag and his journal, and a particular feeling he associated with decisions that could not be walked back. The street was the same as it had been on both previous visits, quiet and overgrown and indifferent to him, and the house on Delwood was the same pale gray it always was in the early morning, door closed, porch undisturbed, the maple tree in the yard standing motionless in the still air. He let himself in the way he had before and stood in the front room and listened. The house had its own silence, layered and specific, different from the silence of abandoned places. There was a quality to it that he had been trying to name since the first visit and had finally settled on the word occupied, not in the sense of activity, but in the sense of presence. The way a room felt different when someone was in it, even if they were not moving. He stood at the base of the staircase and looked up. The staircase was straightforward, 12 steps, a landing, a right turn, and from where he stood, he could see the edge of the landing and nothing beyond it. He put his hand on the banister and started up. He moved slowly and kept his weight toward the wall side of each step to minimize creaking, a technique he had learned in the early month from a man who had grown up hunting and who had not survived long enough to put much of his knowledge to further use. He reached the landing and turned and saw the short upper hallway. 3 doors, 2 open and 1 closed. The closed door was at the end of the hall. He checked the open rooms first. The bathroom was undisturbed, towels on the rack and the arrangement of a household that had expected to use them again. The second bedroom was small, a guest room by the look of it, a single bed made up neatly with a quilt, a wooden chair in a corner with nothing on it. He stood in the doorway of each room for a full minute and cataloged every detail, and then moved the closed door at the end of the hall. He put his ear to it first. He heard breathing. It was slow and shallow and irregular in the specific way of the turn, not the rhythm of sleep, but something that served a similar purpose, a kind of reduced state that Owen had observed in turn individuals during daylight hours when they were not responding to stimuli. He had noted this in his journal 6 weeks ago and had not had a framework for it at the time. He had one now. He turned the handle and opened the door slowly. She was in the corner of the room, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn loosely up, her head tilted slightly to one side. The room was a bedroom, the primary one, with a bed that had not been slept in and a dresser with a mirror above it and curtains drawn across the window that let in a thin line of gray light. She did not react to the door opening. Her eyes were open but unfocused. The clouded stillness he had seen in every turned individual he had ever been close enough to observe, and her hands rested in her lap with the palms upward in a way that struck him as so purely undefensive that he had to stop and register it separately from everything else. He stepped into the room. She did not move. He moved to the side of the room rather than toward her and put his back against the wall and stood still and watched her and waited. 2 minutes passed. On the third minute, her eyes moved. Not toward him, toward the dresser. He followed the direction of her gaze and looked at the dresser and saw what she was looking at. On top of the dresser, in front of the mirror, there was a small collection of objects. A hairbrush, a tube of hand lotion with the cap placed neatly beside it, a folded piece of paper, a photograph in a small frame, different from the one in the kitchen. This one showing a younger version of Judith standing beside a teenage girl with the same jawline and the same squint in bright sunlight. Owen looked at the photograph and then looked at Judith and then looked at the photograph again. He crossed to the dresser slowly and picked up the folded piece of paper and opened it. It was a hand-drawn map, rough but recognizable, showing a series of streets with a circle marked on one of them. The circle was on a street 2 blocks from Camp Ridgeline. He stood with the paper in his hands and felt something shift in his understanding of everything he had been documenting. She was not simply returning to a familiar location out of behavioral residue. She had drawn a map. The mechanism required for that was not the same mechanism that made a turned individual wander toward a sound or press against a fence. Drawing a map required intent. It required a retention of spatial information across time and the ability to represent it abstractly. It required, at some level he was not yet equipped to fully define, something that resembled thought. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket and turned back to the room. Judith was looking at him, not at the dresser, not at the space between them, at him. Her eyes had the same clouded quality they always had, but they were directed at him with an attention that was oriented and held, and he stood very still and returned her gaze and waited to see what she would do. She raised her right hand. The movement was slow and effortful, the resistance of deteriorating muscle against a signal that was fighting its way through damage, but it was purposeful, and she held her hand up with the palm toward him, and the fingers loosely opened for 3 seconds before it dropped back to her lap. Owen did not move for a long time after that. He stood against the wall opposite her and looked at her and tried to find the clinical language for what he had just seen and could not, because the clinical language he had available was built on a model that did not include this. He stayed in the room for another 20 minutes, not approaching her, not speaking, simply observing. She did not raise her hand again. She did not attack. She returned to the unfocused state she had been in when he entered and stayed there, breathing slowly in the corner, while the gray light through the curtain shifted incrementally, and Owen stood witness to something he did not have words for yet, but that he was already certain was the most important thing he had ever seen. He left the house with a map in his pocket and 4 pages of new notes, and the image of her raised hand sitting in the center of his mind where it would stay for a very long time. He got back to camp to find Lena waiting for him just inside the gate with her arms crossed, and an expression that told him something had happened while he was gone. She said Declan had called a camp meeting for that evening. She said someone had reported to Declan that Owen had been making solo runs to the eastern blocks on a regular basis. She said Declan was not happy. Owen asked her if she had told him anything. She said no. He nodded and walked to medical bay and sat down and looked at the map for a long time before he put in the back of his journal between the last 2 pages. And he thought about Agnes and what the circle on the map meant, and whether Judith had drawn it before or after Agnes had come to camp. And the answer to that question was one he was not sure he was ready for. The camp meeting happened at dusk around the main fire. Declan stood at the edge of the circle and spoke the way he always spoke at meetings, without preamble and without softening. He said there had been consistent, unusual turn activity near the eastern fence for over a week, and that at least 2 camp members had observed behavior that did not match established patterns. The eastern fence line would have an additional watch posted from dusk to dawn, and any turn individual displaying atypical behavior near the perimeter was to be reported immediately and addressed by a clearing team within the hour. He looked at Owen while he said the word addressed. Owen sat on a supply crate at the edge of the firelight and kept his expression neutral and said nothing. After the meeting broke up, he stood and watched people disperse, and then he felt a hand on his arm and turned to find Agnes standing beside him with her face angled away from the fire, so her expression was half in shadow. She said she needed to tell him something. He waited. She said she had gone to the eastern fence on her own 2 nights ago, outside her rotation, because she had not been able to sleep and wanted to see it again. She said she had seen it. She said it had been standing at the fence the way she remembered, and that when she had moved closer it had not retreated, and had not attacked, and had looked at her in a way that she said she could not explain, except that it had not felt like the way the others looked at you. She said it had felt like being recognized. Owen looked at her face in the firelight and understood that she was telling him something true, and that she did not know how true it was. And the weight of what he was holding away from her pressed against the inside of his chest with persistence that felt less like caution and more like a debt. He told her that what she had experienced was consistent with what he had been observing. He told her he was gathering information, and that he would tell her more when he had enough to tell properly. She searched his face for a moment, the way people search faces when they suspected the answer they were getting was not the whole answer. Then she nodded and walked away toward the sleeping quarters, and Owen stood by the dying fire and stared at the coals and thought about everything converging toward the same point at a speed he was no longer certain he could manage. He went to the medical bay and took the map out of the journal and looked at the circle again, 2 blocks from the camp, marked with intention, by a hand that could barely hold a pencil anymore, but it held one long enough to put down something specific, something directed. He thought about what it meant to mark a location on a map. You marked a location because you wanted someone to find it, or because you wanted to remember how to get there. Judith already knew how to get to the camp. She had been coming to the fence for weeks. She had not come through the gate. She had not approached the perimeter in a way that triggered the watch. She had stood at a distance and waited and looked and gone back to the house. She was not trying to get in. She was trying to tell someone where to look. He put the map back in the journal and lay down on his cot without taking his boots off and stared at the ceiling and made himself go through the full logic of it from the beginning. Everything he had seen and noted and withheld, building it into a structure that could hold the weight of what he was going to have to do next, which was tell someone the truth, and figure out which truth to tell first and how much of it the right person could hold. Owen told Lena everything the next morning, not the edited version he'd been carrying around, not the version that stopped short of the map or the raised hand or the 3 seconds in the kitchen doorway, but all of it, in the order it happened, sitting on the supply crates in the back of the medical bay while the camp moved through its morning routines on the other side of the curtain. Lena listened the way she always listened without interrupting, but he could see the quality of her stillness changing as he went, becoming something tighter and more concentrated. And when he finished, she sat with it for a long moment before she said anything. She said she believed him. She said it plainly and without qualification, which he had not been certain of until she did, and the relief of it was sharper than he expected. Then she said that the map was the part that scared her most, and he told her it was the part that scared him most too. They sat with that together for a minute. She asked him what he thought Judith was trying to communicate with the circle on the map. He told her he had 2 working theories. The first was that Judith was marking Agnes's location, that some remaining fragment of her was oriented toward her daughter, and the map was an expression of that orientation, an attempt to close a distance she could feel, but not cross. The second theory was one he had not written in the journal because it was larger and more destabilizing, and he had needed more time with it before he put it in writing. He told Lena that he thought it was possible the map was not for him, that Judith had not known he would come to the house, that she had been making the map for herself as a document, the way a person with a deteriorating memory made notes to anchor the things they did not want to lose. Lena was quiet again. Then she said that if that was true, the implications for what was happening inside the turn went further than behavioral residue or fragmentary routine. Owen said yes. She said that meant Declan's clearing protocol was not just a tactical disagreement. He said yes to that too. They were still sitting there when Agnes pushed through the curtain with an expression on her face that told Owen the window he had been trying to preserve had just closed. She said she knew. She said she had heard them. Not all of it. Not from the beginning, but enough. And she stood in the entrance to the medical bay with her arms at her sides and her jaw set and looked at Owen with a steadiness that cost her something visible and asked him directly whether the turned individual at the eastern fence was her mother. He did not lie to her. He told her yes, and he watched her receive it, and he did not look away while she did, because she deserved to have someone not look away. She did not cry. She made a sound that was not quite crying, and then she stopped it and stood very still and asked him how long he had known. He told her since the second visit to the house. She asked him why he had not told her. He told her the truth, that he had not known what telling her would do, and that he had been trying to gather enough information to give her something more than just the worst news of her life. She looked at him for a long time after that. Then she said she wanted to see her. Owen started to explain why that was not straightforward. The risks and the variables and the things he did not yet understand about what Judith was and was not capable of. And Agnes said she understood all of that and she wanted to see her anyway. He was still working out how to respond to that when Declan came through the curtain. He did not knock. He looked at the three of them and read the room with a quick assessment of a man who had learned to read rooms fast and said he needed Owen outside. His voice had the flat quality that meant the conversation was not going to be a negotiation. Owen told Agnes to stay in the medical bay and followed Declan out into the gray morning. Declan walked him to the eastern fence line without speaking and pointed. 20 yards out, visible in the early light, Judith was standing at the fence, not in her usual position, not at the limb of the wire, but closer to the point where the fence met the old gate post. And she was not alone. There was a second turned individual beside her, a man Owen did not recognize. Also still, also oriented toward the camp with the same quality of directed attention that Owen had spent weeks documenting in Judith alone. Declan said he was sending the clearing team out within the hour. Owen said he needed more time. Declan said he had been giving him time, and that what he was looking at was two of them now, and that the pattern was escalating. Owen said that escalating was not the right word for what he was observing, and that he had evidence Declan needed to see before any action was taken. Declan looked at him with the flat patience that meant his decision was already made, but he was willing to go through the form of hearing the argument. Owen went back to Medical Bay and took the map out of the journal, and brought it to Declan, and showed it to him, and explained what it was, and where he had found it, and what he believed it meant. Declan looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at Owen. He asked him how many times he had been to the house. Owen told him 3. Declan asked if he had gone alone each time. Owen said yes. Declan folded the map and held it, and was quiet, and Owen watched him process the information, and understood from the set of his face that he was not updating his conclusions. He was building a case for why none of it changed anything. Declan said that a turned individual drawing a map was not evidence of recovery. It was evidence of a more dangerous kind of threat. He said that a turned individual with directional intent and the ability to document information was not something to observe. It was something to address before it became something the camp could not manage. Owen said that was not what the evidence showed. Declan said that Owen was a doctor and not a security assessment, and that the difference mattered. He handed the map back to Owen and said the team was going out at mid-morning and that Owen was not to go near the eastern fence or the residential blocks to the east until further notice. He walked away before Owen could respond. Owen stood at the fence with the map in his hand and looked at Judith and the man beside her standing in the morning light and felt the situation narrowing around him into something that was going to require a decision he could not postpone. He went back inside and found Lena and Agnes together at the medical bay and looked at both of them and said they had until mid-morning. Agnes asked what mid-morning meant. Owen told her it meant they had a small window to go to Delwood Street before Declan's team went out, and that if she wanted to see her mother had to be now, in the next 2 hours, before that option was removed permanently. Agnes did not hesitate. She said she was ready. Lena said she was coming, and her tone made clear it was not a question. The three of them left through the northern gate, which was unmanned in the mornings, moving quickly and close to the building line the way Owen had learned to move in the early months. He set the pace and kept them off the main road, and they covered the 4 blocks of Delwood in under 10 minutes. He stopped them at the edge of the yard and explained what to expect inside the house, the closed door and the arrangement of the kitchen, and the way Judith moved and what she had done on his previous visits, including the raised hand, which he had not told Agnes yet. Agnes looked at the house for a long moment when he finished. Then she walked across the yard and up onto the porch and opened the front door and went in. Owen and Lena followed. The house was the same as it always was. The mug on the table, the folded blanket. Agnes stopped in the middle of the front room and looked at each object in turn, and Owen watched her face and said nothing. She moved to the kitchen doorway and looked at the mug and at the photograph on the windowsill, and reached out and touched the frame very lightly with 2 fingers. Then she looked at the ceiling. Owen told her Judith spent daylight hours in the upstairs bedroom. Agnes looked at the staircase. She went up without asking for permission or confirmation, and Owen followed close behind with Lena a step behind him. The door at the end of the hall was closed. Agnes stood in front of it and put her hand flat on the wood and stood there for a breath before she opened it. Judith was in the corner the way she always was, back against the wall, knees loosely drawn up, eyes open and unfocused. Agnes made a sound low her throat and stopped in the doorway. Owen stepped up beside her and put a hand briefly on her arm and then stepped back to give her the space. Agnes stood in the doorway and looked at her mother for a long time without moving or speaking. The room was quiet. Judith's eyes stayed unfocused. Then Agnes said, "Mom," very quietly, not loudly, barely above a breath. The kind of word said when you know it might not work, but you cannot not say it. Judith's eyes moved. Not a dramatic shift. Not the full orientation of the kitchen doorway and counter, but a slow drift toward the source of sound that stopped when it reached Agnes and held there. The clouded gaze resting on her daughter's face with quality that Owen stood behind them both and witnessed, and would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for. Agnes's breath came out of her in a long, unsteady exhale. She took one step into the room. Judith's right hand lifted from her lap. The same slow and effortful rise Owen had seen before. The same resistance of damaged muscle against the signal fighting through. And it held in the air between them, palm open. Fingers loosely extended, aimed at nothing and at Agnes at the same time. Agnes reached out and put her hand against her mother's palm. Owen watched it happen. He watched Judith's fingers make the smallest possible closing movement against Agnes's hand. Not a grip. Not anything that would qualify as a grasp in a clinical assessment, but a response. Contact answered with contact. He wrote nothing down. He stood in the doorway of that room and understood that the data he had been building for weeks had just acquired a weight that no journal entry could properly carry. They were all three still standing there, none of them moving, when they heard the gunshots coming from the direction of the camp. Owen moved first. He told Agnes to stay with her mother and do not open the door for anyone, and he was out of the room before she could respond, taking the stairs fast with Lena right behind him. The gunshots had come from the north. two of them in quick succession, and then a third space further apart, which meant it was not a single target situation. He and Lena crossed the yard to run and took the back route toward the camp, staying off the main road. And as they got closer, he could hear voices raised and the specific quality of commotion that meant something had come to the perimeter rather than something happening at it. They came through the northern gate, and Owen stopped and read the scene. The turned man who had been standing at the eastern fence beside Judith that morning was inside the camp. He was not attacking. He was standing in the open space between the supply warehouse and the cook fire with three of Declan's people in a loose arc around him, weapons raised, and he was standing still in the middle of it with the same quality of directed stillness Owen had come to recognize over weeks of observation, not reacting to the shouting, not orienting toward the nearest person, simply standing in the middle of the camp with his arms at his sides, as though he had arrived somewhere he intended to be. Declan was at the far side of the arc with a rifle and a face that had moved past the flat patience of that morning into something colder and more certain. Owen walked into the space between Declan and the turned man and held up both hands. Declan told him to move. Owen said, "Not yet." Someone in the arc said something sharp and afraid, and Owen kept his eyes on Declan and did not move from the spot. He said he needed 2 minutes, and that what happened in those 2 minutes would determine whether they were making an informed decision or a permanent mistake. Declan said this was not a medical situation. Owen said it was exactly a medical situation. He said the individual in front of them had walked into the camp without attacking anyone, which was not consistent with any behavioral pattern they had documented in the turn, and which meant they were looking at something outside their existing framework, and that outside their existing framework was precisely where medicine operated and where security protocols were the least equipped to make good decisions. The camp had gathered. He could feel them on the periphery. The 60 people whose survival was the only reason any of this mattered, standing at the edges of the open space and watching. Declan said he had 30 seconds. Owen turned to the turned man and looked at him directly and said nothing for 3 seconds, establishing the eye contact the way he had learned to establish it with Judith, waiting for the orientation to settle. The man's clouded eyes found him and held. Owen reached into his jacket and took out the field journal and opened it to the back pages where his notes were, and held it out, not toward the man, but in his direction, a visible object, and said clearly that he was not a threat, and that he was trying to understand. He knew the words themselves meant nothing. The gesture was what mattered. The man's eyes moved the journal. They stayed on it. Then his right arm came up slowly and his hand opened, and he pressed his palm flat against the side of his own head, just above the ear, and held it there. Owen looked at that gesture and felt every piece of what he had been documenting for weeks lock into a single coherent shape. He turned back to Declan and said that what they had just seen was communication, that the man had just indicated his own head in direct response to Owen holding out written notes, and that the implication of that was that he understood, at some level that Owen could not yet fully quantify, what written documentation was and what it represented. Declan said it was a muscle spasm. Someone in the arc laughed, short and frightened. Owen said it was not a muscle spasm. He said he had been documenting behavioral anomalies in the turn for 2 months, and that what he had was a consistent pattern of retained cognition in a subset of individuals that included purposeful return to familiar locations, object arrangement, spatial mapping, and now direct gestural response to external stimulus. He said the turned woman at the eastern fence had drawn a map. He said she had reached out and made contact with her daughter that morning in a house on Delwood Street. The camp was completely silent. Declan looked at him with an expression Owen had not seen on him before, something that was not anger and not certainty, but a crack in certainty. And Owen understood he had one more thing to say, and that it had to be the right thing. He said that if even a fraction of what he documented was accurate, and he was certain enough of it to stake the credibility he had spent 11 months building in this camp, then the terms were not what they had agreed they were, and every decision built on that agreement needed to be revisited before it became irreversible. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Agnes came to the northern gate. She was alone. Owen looked at her, and she looked back at him and shook her head once, and he understood what that meant, and he held in the way he had learned to hold the things that could not be dealt with immediately, setting it to one side with the intention of returning to it, keeping his face neutral and his attention forward. Agnes crossed the open space and stopped beside Owen and looked at the man standing in the center of the ark and then at Declan. She said his name and told him her mother had been the figure at the eastern fence. She said she had seen her that morning and that she had held her hand. She said it clearly and without pleading and without breaking, and Owen watched the camp hear it and watched the shape of the moment change as it moved through the people standing on the periphery. Declan lowered the rifle 1 inch. It was not a surrender and it was not an agreement, but it was a hesitation, and hesitation was all Owen needed. He told Declan to give him 48 hours. He said he would document everything he had observed in a form that the full camp could evaluate, and that after 48 hours, if Declan still believed the clearing protocol was the right call, then Owen would not stand in the way of it. Declan looked at the turned man, standing still in the center of the camp. He looked at Agnes. He looked at Owen. He said, 24 hours. Owen said yes. The Ark lowered their weapons by degrees, the slow unwinding of a confrontation that had not resolved but had been deferred, and the turned man stood in the middle of it and did not move until Owen walked to the eastern gate and opened it and stood to the side. The man turned and walked through it without hesitation and disappeared into the pale afternoon light beyond the wire. Owen watched him go and then looked down at the journal in his hand and thought about what 24 hours meant and what he needed to prove inside of it. He thought about Judith and the map and the mug on the table and the raised hand and Agnes pressing her palm against her mother's in her room that smelled of dust and old candles. He thought about the man walking calmly back to wherever he had come from as though he had accomplished something. He thought about what it meant that there were 2 of them now, whether 2 implied 3 and 3 implied more, and how far that extended before it stopped being a medical anomaly and became something the existing vocabulary did not yet contain. He went back to Medical Bay and opened the journal to a clean page and wrote until the light outside had gone from gray to dark, and when he finally set the journal down and looked at what he had written, he knew it was either the most important document in Camp Ridgeline or the last thing he was ever going to put his name on, and he was not certain yet which one it was, and he understood with a clarity that sat quietly at the bottom of everything else that the answer to that question was not going to be decided by the evidence. It was going to be decided by the people, and people, in his experience, were the variable that medicine had never been able to fully account for. He set the pen down and looked at the curtains separating him from the main floor and listened to the camp on the other side of it. He could hear the low murmur of people talking the way they talked after something had shaken the routine. Voices kept low. The register of people not sure what they were allowed to think yet. He had heard that sound in hospitals after difficult disclosures, after a diagnosis that reorganized a family's understanding of their situation in ways they had not agreed to. He knew what it meant. The information had landed, but the interpretation had not settled, and the next several hours would determine whether it became something workable or something that calcified into a new kind of fear. He thought about what he would say to the camp in 24 hours. He had been a doctor long enough to know that evidence was not the same as persuasion, and that the gap between them was where most of the damage happened. He had presented sound cases to hospital boards and been overruled by people whose resistance had nothing to do with the data. He had watched diagnoses be dismissed because the person receiving them was not ready to have the thing named. He did not think Declan was unreasonable. He thought Declan was operating from a framework that had kept 60 people alive, and that any threat to that framework felt, from the inside of it, like a threat to the 60 people themselves. That was not stupidity. It was a predictable output of 11 months of making survival the only metric. Owen understood it, and he could not fully argue against it even now. What he could do was show them the alternative metric, not safety against safety, but a larger picture of what they were standing at the edge of and what the obligation to living was toward that fact once they could no longer claim ignorance. He picked up the pen and added one more paragraph. The question facing the camp was not whether the turn were dangerous. The question was whether danger was the only thing they were, and whether that changed how the living were obligated to act. Anyone who claimed certainty on either side was working from a position the evidence had not earned. He put the pen down and closed the journal and sat in the medical bay in the dark and thought about Judith going back to the house every night to sit in the corner of her bedroom and maintain a space that her daughter was no longer in. And he thought about Agnes pressing her palm against her mother's open hand. And he thought about a man walking calmly through an open gate as though he understood what had been offered to him. And he sat with all of it in the quiet and the dark and did not try to resolve it into something smaller than it was. Outside, the wire of the night was the same as it had always been, full of things moving through it that the camp could not see, and Owen sat with his journal in his hands and waited for morning and whatever was going to ask of him.